This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
We have a very unusual practice. Tisha B'Av, of course, is the culmination of 3 weeks of mourning. 3 weeks when we delay all celebration. We don't make weddings. We don't take haircuts. We're mourning the devastating tragedies of our people. And then we move on to a more intense period of mourning. We move on to the 9 days. The 9 days we don't wash, we don't eat meat. Lo Yaleinu, it's Begeder Shiva. And then we have Shvuah Shechal by Tisha B'Av, where the mourning is even more intense. We have Erev Tisha B'Av, Sudas HaMafsekes, where Chazal tell us Sudas HaMafsekes is Kemesoi Mutal Lefanav. And finally, we've reached the wretched day, the worst day on our calendar, the day of tears, a day that's been a lightning rod of Jewish tragedy. The Mishnah says at the end of Tainis, 5 tragedies occurred on Tisha B'Av. Yom shehuchbalu b'itzarais, first Beis HaMikdash, second Beis HaMikdash. And the Mishnah says 5 tragedies occurred on Tisha B'Av. Of course, throughout history, there have been many tragedies that have also occurred on Tisha B'Av. In the year 1295, the community of England was expelled. Community of France was expelled on Tisha B'Av. Of course, the Spanish expulsion was on Tisha B'Av. World War I began on Tisha B'Av. Some say Auschwitz began on Tisha B'Av. So we would expect when the wretched day finally comes, the day that Yirmiyah Hanavi was so saddened and sickened by, because Yirmiyah was born on Tisha B'Av, Yirmiyah cursed the day of his birth. So we would expect when the day would come, we would have an entire day of intense Avelos. After all, for an Avel, there are at least 7 days, and here it is, here we are, and in a few hours, it's all over. And we get up, and we don't sit on the floor, and we put on the tefillin. Why do we get off the floor? What's the meaning of this custom? What's the meaning of this practice? We've spoken about it in the past. V'yein beis hamedrash b'li chidush. Tisha B'Av is a very difficult day. We say the Kinnot every year. We try to feel the pain. We try to connect. We try to feel sensitive. And at times we're moved, and at times we feel the tsar. And other times we're so hardened, we're so coarsened, we're so jaded. It's very hard to connect. What do the Kinnot mean to us? What's their significance? What is their relevance to me and to you in Tafshin Ayin Zayin 2017? What are we supposed to take out of it? Rabbi Berelwein, in his autobiography, he writes a story how in 1994 he moved to Eretz Yisrael, and he musters up the courage to try to obtain an Israeli driver's license, something that most Americans fail on their first attempt. And somehow he's taking the driving test, and the law is that the driver cannot let on how the driver did. But the tester sort of let it slip. He said, Rabbi, you're a pretty good driver. So Rabbi Wein asked, what exactly impressed you with my driving? He said, Rabbi, you do what nobody else does. When you pulled out of that space, you first looked in the rear view mirror, and only then you pulled out. Everyone else just pulls right out of there. Marv Rabbi, that is exactly the problem with contemporary society. No one looks in the rear view mirror of Jewish history. We think the Jewish world began in 1950, 1960, 1970, somewhere in Brooklyn, and it further developed in the 5 towns. Maybe 1949. And we pull out and we move forward into the traffic of life in America with disastrous results. But you can only proceed successfully in this world if you could see clearly in the rearview mirror and understand where did we come from, what we've endured, what we've suffered, what we've traversed through. And if you know where you're coming from, then you know what your role is and you know where to go and how to head there. And that is the vital role of Tisha B'Av and the critical role of understanding what the Kinnot are. I'd like to share with you a thought that's been burning in my soul. 75 years ago, 1942, there's a young boy, he's 5 years old, and he's stretching out his neck to see his father, to get a glimpse of his father, the Rav of Pietrikov. He's standing at the Umschlagplatz, the assembly point for deportation. And the Rav of the city of Pietrikov, Rav Moshe Chaim Lau, one of the Gedolei Rabbanim in Europe of the time, he's standing there with his impressive black beard and regal kapata, and he's surrounded by Yidden. The Germans had just removed him from the shul, holding the Sefer Torah, and together with 28,000 Jews, they were about to be deported to Treblinka. And this little boy, Yisrael Meir Lau, is trying to get the last glimpse of his father. When the Nazis ordered that all the Jews shave off their beards, so all the Yidden came to Rav Moshe Chaim, can we allow the Nazis to shave off our beards and pay us? And he said, you have to. You got to save yourself. But he was stricter with himself. And he kept his beard and payas not only to preserve the Messiah, but to maintain a modicum of dignity of the Rabbanos for Kavod HaTzibur. And now this young boy, Yisrael Meir, sees his tata, and he sees the Gestapo taking the mica, the club, bashing his father on the head, kicking his father with nailed boots. His father's threatened by dogs, and he sees the tata. He's faltering from the force of the blow, but with astonishing spiritual energy. The tata braces himself and stands at full stance, not to diminish the Kavod HaTzibur of the Rabbanos. But then his father was taken off. The women and the children were now separated into the main synagogue in Pietrikov. And this young boy, Yisrael Meir Lau, and his mother and his older brother, Shmuel, or Milik, they're sitting there in the shul in pitch black, and they're witnessing inhuman scenes. There's a Ukrainian guard with a flashlight, and he's shining it around, and he sees an 80-year-old woman up in the woman's balcony. She's holding on to the wooden balcony, and she flashes her ring. And the Ukrainian guard catches wind of the ring, and he shouts to her in Russian, "Davai, davai, give it to me, give it to me." The woman was frozen. The Ukrainian guard races up to the woman like a tiger attacking his prey. He grabs the woman by her shoulders. He hurls her down on the ground. He stomps on her, and he rips the ring off the finger. That was the atmosphere in the shul on that night. Hundreds of women, children, packed into the cramped synagogue, gripped with terror, fearing for their lives. In the middle of the night, the synagogue door swings open, and two Gestapo walk in. They're holding a lamp, and they both stand by the doorway. And they're facing each other, leaving a very narrow passage in between them. In a thunderous voice, one of them declares, "I'm now going to read a list of names. Anyone whose name I read, schnell, schnell, get out of here. You could save yourself. Everyone else inside." And he began to read the list of names who would be released. And the first name he read was Lau, Chaya, Yisrael Meir's mother. But she couldn't move because she's waiting to hear them call the names of her two children so that the three of them could leave together in safety. And she's waiting, and their names were not called. Everyone realized whoever's name was not called would be stuck inside, their fate sealed. And the Germans and the Gestapo, order and discipline was second nature to them. And they read the list and they said, one of the people we called did not walk out. Last chance. And Chaya Lau, her maternal instinct aroused, grabs her two boys. She says, I'm coming, so they don't close the door. And she plans the move quickly and decisively. She understands, and the boys did not need to be told, that they could not make a sound, and they needed to keep as close as possible to their mother. Somehow they're going to walk out of that shul as one. Somehow they need to meld together with the mother and slip out from those two Gestapo standing at the door, allowing a narrow passageway. And they walk sideways, hoping beyond hope. But for three people to get out of that narrow passageway, It was impossible. And the 5-year-old boy, Yisrael Lau, makes it through in his mother's coat. And his mother makes it through. But then a German noticed a little bit more movement than anticipated. And he swung down his arm violently, cutting off Shmulek, who had to stay behind. So the two of them were saved, and Shmuel was separated. They never saw him again. On that day, Shmuel was sent to Treblinka. And I'm sure many of you know that this Yisrael Meir Lau survived that selection, later on became the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, and later the chief rabbi of Israel. And the question, Rabbi Lau says, haunts him and plagues him his entire life, is why me? Why was I saved? Why was I selected while my brother had to be sent to Treblinka? Not why did God do it? What does God want from me? What am I still doing here? And if you say Kinnot with a little bit of sensitivity, this should be a very serious question that we should all ask ourselves. What in the world am I doing here? How am I still around? In Egypt, 80% of the people perished. Apparently, our ancestors made it through. During Churban Bayis Rishon, the death toll was enormous. Somehow, your ancestors made it through. Josephus writes, Churban Bayis Sheni, 1.1 million Jews were slaughtered. 200,000 Jews were forcibly baptized in 1391. 300,000 Jews lost their homes in 1492. Tens of thousands during the Crusades, during Chmielnicki pogroms, 6 million in the gas chambers and the crematoria. And how often we say that for a Jew to be here today, it's not statistically unlikely, it's not highly improbable, it's downright impossible. So how can we not ask ourselves the question, after reading 45 Kinnot, how am I not part of that? What in the world am I doing here? Traditionally, since time immemorial, Tisha B'Av has been selection day. You remember in the Midbar? Every Tisha B'Av, 600,000 Jews the first year would dig their own graves. And in the morning, 15,000 did not wake up in the morning. And there was crying and moaning in thousands and thousands of Jewish homes, because 15,000 Jews did not survive Tisha B'Av. And then in year 2, another 15,000. Until year 40, there are only 15,000 Jews left between 20 and 60. And those 15,000 Jews dug their own graves, Leil Tisha B'Av. And when they woke up in the morning, they were pleasantly pleased to find that they're still walking on planet Earth. And when those 15,000 Jews walked into Eretz Yisrael with Yehoshua ben Nun, together with the children, together with the teenagers, they understood that if God selected them and kept them alive, they have a purpose on this world. Because 99% of the Yidden didn't make it. 80% perished in Mitzrayim. 90% perished in the Midbar. They were miyuta de miyuta de miyuta. They were hand cherry-picked. And they walked into Eretz Yisrael, biyad Rama, understanding that they were selected for a monumental role. But we read this morning that when does the danger come? Ki soiled banim ubnei banim. They were there one generation, they were there a second generation, and then they forgot that they were survivors. And they forgot that 90% of Klal Yisrael died in the Midbar, and the rest of them died in Mitzrayim. And they thought Jewish life began in Israel a couple years ago for my grandfather. They forgot to look in the rear view mirror of Jewish history. And this is the exact same challenge that we face today. When our parents and our grandparents grew up in America, they understood. Their children, their grandchildren of survivors, they were handpicked, they were cherry-picked, they have a role in this world, they have a mission in this world, and Jewish life did not begin in Flatbush or in the 5 towns. But now we are holding exactly what we read this morning, Ki soilid banim ubnei banim. We're not survivors, we're not the children of survivors, we're the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of survivors. And the Torah says, V'noi shantem ba'aretz. You forget where you come from. You think the Jewish world began in New York. The same disaster that they were facing back then always repeats itself. And the avodah of Tisha B'Av is to open up the table of contents of Jewish history and realize Jewish history began a very long time ago. And for us to be here, we had to navigate 45 kinnos of Churban Bayis Rishon, Bayis Sheni, and many, many tragedies. You know, there's a big question about Moshe Rabbeinu. Why do we call Moshe by his non-Jewish name, Moshe? You know, Moshe is the name that Paro's daughter called him. The daughter of Paro comes down to the Nile. She sees Moshe floating in the crib that his mother made for him so that he shouldn't be drowned by the tides and eaten by the crocodiles. And the Torah says, she reached forth her hand, she drew him out of the water, Vatikra Shemoi Moshe Kimin Amayim Mishisihu. Do you understand what this means? This wasn't his Hebrew name. It's like Eric, lahavdil, Jeffrey, Kevin. Moshe is not his Hebrew name. It's not the name his mother gave him at his bris milah. She called him Avigdor, Yekusiel, Yehonasan. Why in the world are we calling Moshe by his Gentile name? And not only us, the Ribono Shel Olam. You know, Moshe, he's the typical Jewish son-in-law. He's working for the shver. He's tending the sheep in the desert. And he sees there's a bush. And the bush is burning, and it burns, and it burns, and it burns, and it's not being consumed. And Chazal say that bush had been burning like that for a very, very long time. And a lot of people saw the bush. But everyone else was busy. They're on the way to work. They had a phone call. They had appointments. They're on the way to the store, and they said, oh, isn't it funny that bush is burning? Very interesting. And everyone else kept on going. But Moshe said, Asura nava era hamara hagodol hazeh. What in the world is going on over here? Madua lo yivasneh. Let me stop for a minute. I know the market's still open. What's going on? Eres hamara hagodol hazeh, madua lo yivar hasneh. And the Ribono Shel Olam says, my goodness, vayar Hashem kisor liros. The man stopped. Someone actually stopped in life. And Moshe came close. And the Ribono Shel Olam said, that's my guy. That's my man. I've been waiting for someone to stop. Vayikra loi mitoy chasneh Moshe, Moshe. He calls him, not Avigdor, not Yekusiel, not Yehonasan. Moshe. Why Moshe? It's not his Jewish name. It's a big question. I have a friend in yeshiva, Ezra Gwertz. He's a grandson of Rabbi Beryl Wein. He sent me a clip of Rabbi Wein. I think he was speaking to his family. And Rabbi Wein was speaking about this question, and he answered the question based on a certain episode that happened to him. Rabbi Wein said that whenever he goes to Yerushalayim, he always makes it his business to go to Yad Vashem, which is a memorial for the 6 million Jews who were destroyed in World War II. And he was told that one year there would be a new exhibit, a new museum. It's called the Children's Museum in memory of the 1.5 million children under the age of 12 who perished in the Holocaust. You know, 1.5 million Jews, 1.5 million children. It's a number that is impossible to fathom. You take 1,000 rooms this size, and then do it another 10 times, and we're not there yet. So there's a Jew in Beverly Hills. His name is Spiegel, Hungarian Jew. 70 years ago, he goes into Auschwitz with his wife and his 5-year-old boy, and 10 months later, he walks out all alone. And he comes to LA, and he's a very successful entrepreneur. And he owns a lot of real estate. He has retail establishments. And he comes to Yad Vashem. He says, I want to make a memorial for my 5-year-old son, but not only my 5-year-old son, I want to make a memorial for the 1.5 million children who perished in the Holocaust. So he gives Yad Vashem $4.5 million. And over the years, he's given tens of millions of dollars to keep it up and to endow it. And Rabbi Wein says he walks into the memorial with his preconceived notions of what a museum should look like. And he expected he'll see pictures, there'll be records, maybe a video, statistics, books, pamphlets. And he was completely unprepared for what he saw. You walk into a room 8-10 stories high, a room 30 times the size of this room. And the room is pitch black. It's so dark you can't even put one foot in front of another. It's palpably black. You could feel the darkness. V'yamesh choshech. And your eyes can't even adjust to the darkness. It's so dark. And finally, when the eye adjusts, in the middle of the immense darkness, there is one candle that is lit. And through the genius of the designer and the architect of this museum, through reflections and mirrors, this one candle becomes 1,000,000 pinpoints of light. So you see little specks of light in the all-pervading darkness. And there's a voice over it. And there's a tape that plays. And the tape does nothing but says names. Hillel Cohen, 3 years old, Vilna. Miriam Goldberg, 7 years old, Sarajevo. Names, 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 until you go insane and can't bear it anymore, and you have to run out of the room. And Rabbi Wein said that when he left the room, there was a thought that he had that sticks with him. I didn't hear my name. I'm of age. I didn't hear my name called out on that tape. And I said to myself that if my name wasn't on that tape, and I'm still here, then I could still do something. And I'm not going to give up, and not going to fall into the darkness. And if I could take one more kid into my yeshiva, I'm going to do it. And if I could open a sefer one more time, I'm going to do it. And if there's one more thing that I could do for Klal Yisrael, then I'm going to do it, if my name was not on that list. Says Rabbi Wein, and then I realized that is why the Rebbeinu Shalom called him Moshe. Because every time Hashem called him Moshe, he reminded him, you should have been eaten by the crocodiles. You should have been taken down by the waves. You want to do my job, please? Moshe, Moshe, do you understand you're a survivor? Could we get something done over here? And then Moshe has no choice but to say, you got me. Hineni. Here I am. Let's do something. If you read the Kinnot carefully, and you want to take out the point of the Kinnot, you have to understand that the Rebbeinu Shalom is calling out to you. And the Rebbeinu Shalom is telling you, Moshe, Moshe, you're not in this book. You made it through 45 Kinnot. Atem nitzavim hayom kolchem. Life didn't start on Central Avenue. There are 45 tragedies that you had to endure and navigate to be standing today. 99.9% did not make it through. So the Rebbeinu Shalom said, could we get something done over here? Didn't I pull you out for a reason? And if you hear the call of the Rebbeinu Shalom, Moshe, Moshe, then we have no alternative than to respond, Hineni. because there's no limit to how much we could strengthen ourselves, strengthen our families, strengthen our communities, and strengthen Klal Yisrael. In 1946, Rabbi Beryl Wein is 11 years old. He's a Ben Yachid, and he's in Chicago. His father says, Beryl, we're going to the airport. He says, what's in the airport? A great rabbi is coming, the chief rabbi of Palestine is coming out. We have to go out to greet him. All the Rabbanim are coming to greet him. We're going to escort him to the Skokie Yeshiva, where he's going to address the Chicago community. Who was this? Rav Herzog, Rav Isaac Halevi Herzog, was a very majestic personality. He alights from the plane. He's wearing a shiny top hat. He's holding a silver cane in one hand. He's holding his Tanakh in another hand. And all the Rabbanim and all the Balabatim and all the Yeshiva Bachim, they go out to greet Rav Herzog at the airport, at Chicago Midway Airport. At the time, some 200 boys from elementary school, from Mesivta, are gathered in the yeshiva. And Rav Herzog gave a 45-minute shiur to the community in Yiddish about a sugya. And then he turns to the Bachrim, to the boys in English, and he says, I have a message for the young men. Rav Herzog was a Rav in Dublin, so he had a slight Irish brag. He said, I just returned from Rome from a meeting with Pope Pius XII. I had with me the names of 10,000 Jewish boys and girls whose parents had placed them with Catholic families, Catholic institutions to save them from the Nazis. The parents did not think they would survive. I said to the Pope, give me back my children. They're ours. I have the names of 10,000 children. Their names, addresses, and parents' name. You've kidnapped our children. Give us back the Kinderlach. And the Pope flatly refused. And the Pope said, I can't even give you one child. The law is that once a child is baptized, he can never be returned to another religion. Every last child has been baptized. We cannot give you one child. I pleaded, said Rav Herzog, and the doors were slammed on my face. And to me, this is not a story. My grandfather writes explicitly that when he was in the DP camps, he met with Rav Herzog. And Rav Herzog told him that during the war, he went to Rome to ask the Pope to put an end to the crematoria, and the Pope said no. And then after the war, he went to the Pope to get back the Jewish children, and he was denied. And Rav Herzog is standing there at the podium in Chicago in front of 200 young men. And he's so overcome with emotion. And he puts his head down on the lectern, and he cries, and he weeps, and he weeps, and he weeps. Says Rabbi Wein, I was never so frightened in my life. The shul was deathly silent. And then the great rabbi defiantly raised his head. His face was beaming red like a lion, and he roars out, there's nothing I could do for these 10,000 children. But I ask of you, young men, what are you going to do for the future of Klal Yisrael? What are you going to do to rebuild the Jewish people? And he repeated himself again and again and again. I cannot do anything for these 10,000 children, but what will you do with your lives? Afterwards, we filed by him, and he shook each and every one of our hands. And he looked each of us in the eye, and he said, did you hear what I said? Are you going to remember what I said? Don't forget what I said. Says Rabbi Wein, my entire life, the words of Rav Herzog ring in my ear. Whenever I'm discouraged and disheartened, I hear Rav Herzog's cry, what are you going to do for the future of Klal Yisrael? And that cry continues to inspire and challenging me and makes all the decisions in my life. If your heart is sensitive to the message of the Kinnot, then how could you not realize that we are miyuta de miyuta? We are the 1% that Atem Nitzavim Hayom Kolchem. How could you not hear the voice of the Rebbeinu Shalom calling out to us on a personal level? Moshe, Moshe, I saved you from the waves. I saved you from the crocodiles. How can you not understand that we all have a job and we have a mission? That we don't know why us, but we have been entrusted to somehow rebuild Klal Yisrael and bring Mashiach. The Rebbeinu Shalom wanted us to be the ones that it should fall on our shoulders. You know, the Mirror Yeshiva, when they were in Shanghai, they took the Trans-Siberian Railroad to Shanghai. And I was at a conference a number of months ago. I heard Rabbi Moshe Weinberger speak. And I contacted him right before Tisha B'Av. He gave me some of the details. That somebody told him many years ago, an outer mirror told him, Rav Matel Rabinowitz, that the Talmidim in the Mirror Yeshiva in Shanghai, they felt that they learned better than any yeshiva in the history of Klal Yisrael. And it's not only because there were no distractions. In fact, legend has it that Rav Nachum would learn with Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, Rav Shmuel Birnbaum, 12 hours daily, consecutively, without break. And the reason they were able to learn what they felt on the highest level of Limud HaTorah in the history of Klal Yisrael, because they felt that Hitler was going to decimate all the yeshivas in Europe. There was no Torah in America. The yeshiva system in Eretz Yisrael was kemat non-existent. And they literally felt that the entire future of Torah rests on their shoulders. And if you feel the achrayus and you feel, you know what, I'm the only one, then you're able to do more than you would be naturally. But if you understand the Kinnot, then you understand we are the only ones. Who else is going to bring Mashiach? It wasn't done yet. It falls on our shoulders. And therefore, the only reaction to Kinnot in middle of the day, in middle of Tisha B'Av, is we have to get off the floor and dust ourselves off and roll up our sleeves and say to ourselves and say to each other and say to our friends and our chaverim, what are we going to do to rebuild Klal Yisrael? And that is the inyan of standing up midday on Tisha B'Av. And on that note, let's begin the first Kinnah. I want to point out something. It's mamish hafli v'fela of the first Kinnah, but you have to look very carefully. Kinnah Vav. Kinnah Vav, of course, was written by Rabbi Lezer HaKalir. In Kinnah Vav, there are 8 paragraphs, but you have to look carefully. Each paragraph has 7 sentences. The 7 sentences each begin with the same letter of the alphabet, except for the first sentence. So, for instance, in the first paragraph, Shavas, Suru is a Samach, Sechi is a Samach, Sakois is a Samach, Sakois is a Samach, Sofku and Sila. There's 7 sentences. 6 begin with the same ois except for the first one. And then again, the second paragraph, they all begin with an ayin except for the first one. The third, they all begin with a pei except for the first one. What is the meaning of the formula of Kinnah Vav? This is mamish hafla v'fela, if you get it. The answer is, listen carefully, why does Kinnah begin with the letter Samach? So you say, it doesn't. That's why. It begins with a shin. No, it begins with the letter Samach. Let me explain. The Medrash says that Eicha consists of 7 aleph bezes. How? Perek Aleph, 22 psukim, Aleph Beis Gimel Daled Hey Vav, Keneged the Aleph Beis. Perek Beis, 22 psukim, Keneged the Aleph Beis. Perek Gimel, 66 psukim, 3 aleph bezes. 3 for Aleph, 3 for Beis, 3 for Gimel. We're up to how many? 5. Perek Daled, an aleph bez. 6. Perek Zayin, it's not according to the aleph bez, but they're 22 psukim. So, the first pasuk, Zachra, is Keneged the Aleph. The 15th pasuk, Shavas, is Keneged the Samach. The formula of Kinnah Vav is that we take all the Samachs, first of Perek Hey, but the Samach of Perek Hey is a Shin. Then the Samach of Perek Daled, then the Samach of Perek Gimel, Gimel, then the Samach of Perek Beis, and then the Samach of Perek Aleph. That's the formula of Kinnah. So Kinnot, for all intents and purposes, begins with the letter Samach. Why does Kinnot begin with the letter Samach? Asks Rav Pinchas Karatzer. Hafla v'fela. If you look in Ashrei, which goes according to the Aleph Beis, every single letter is represented except for the letter Nun. Why is there no Nun in Ashrei? Frek the Gemara in Brachas, why is there no Nun in Ashrei? Says the Gemara, because David did not want to be merames to the nefila of Klal Yisrael, so he omitted the Nun. But even though he didn't want to omit the Nun, didn't want to mention the falling of Klal Yisrael, he immediately supported us, Soymech Hashem l'chol hanoiflim. So there's no Nun, but even though there's no Nun, there's an immediate Samach for the support, for the chizuk, for the smicha of Soymech Hashem l'chol hanoiflim. Says Reb Pinchas Karatzer, we're sitting on the floor. Sitting on the floor on Tisha B'Av is the ultimate nefila. Whenever there's nefila for Klal Yisrael, who comes to support us? The Soymech Hashem l'chol hanoiflim. Mamela Kinnot begins with the letter Samach, because whenever there's a Nun, the Samach comes immediately. Where else do we find this? If you look in Parashat Shlach, by the ultimate nefila of Klal Yisrael, you have Vayivku ha'am balayla hahu, the chet of the Meraglim. What does the pasuk say? Vayahas kalev. Look in the Sefer Torah, there's a big Samach. Why? Because after the ultimate nefila, kalev comes to support us. Soymech Hashem l'chol hanoiflim. When we have Isser, how are we mevatel Isser? B'shishim. Why? Isser is the ultimate nefila. If you have the Samach supports us. So whenever you have the Ois Nun, what comes next? The Ois Samach. That's why whenever Klal Yisrael falls, Ribon Shem immediately supports us with the Samach. If you have a Nun, Samach, Nes. That's why the ultimate Nes will happen on Tisha B'Av. Mashiach is born on Tisha B'Av. Why? Because Tisha B'Av is the Ois Nun, the ultimate Nefila. Memela Ribon Shem will come. We should take a bizoicha to see the Soymech Hashem l'chol hanoiflim. The Rebbe Shem should support us, sustain us, and help us get off of the ground with the ultimate miracle, with the ultimate Samach, with the birth of Mashiach Tzidkenu, Sheyavai b'mhera v'yameinu. Amen. Begin with Kinnot. There's no pausing. Not record. It could stream live, but not record. Okay? So keep this on.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.